Kia ora and welcome to this edition of the Maxim Institute Book Club. My name is Jeremy, and this month I'm joined by our researchers Danielle and Kieran. Hello, guys.
Hi, Jeremy.
Hello.
Now, Danielle, you were actually the one who chose this book, Together, by Dr. Vivek Murthy. Can you just let us know right from the beginning how you came across the book, what made you decide to suggest it for your pick for the book club, and maybe just a little bit about what you thought?
Yeah. I had actually heard about this book last year. I was on holiday with some friends, and one of the girls had brought this book with her and was reading it at the time, and I'd kind of stored it away. I'd asked her some questions about it, and she said, "Oh, it's actually a beautifully looking book. It looks really great, and that appeals to me." And so I was asking her some questions about it, and
so you literally did judge a book by its cover.
I really did. I'm sorry. But I was asking her questions about it, and she was telling me about how it's all about community and loneliness, and it sparked something in my brain because this is something that I've read about and thought about previously, and kind of stuck in there. And then at the end of last year, Book Depository actually recommended it to me as a book that I might enjoy. And I
Man, they know you well.
They do. I was sucked in and bought it. That's right.
Like, do you remember how much you like the look of this book?
Exactly. And I bought it and suggested it for this conversation prior to having actually read it, because community is something that I care deeply about. I think relationship and our relationships with people who are different from us, who are the same as us, these are incredibly powerful and interesting things. And I was curious to see what Dr. Vivek said, and particularly in response to, as he calls it, the loneliness epidemic. After a year of COVID, I thought that was a very interesting conversation for us to have. And as I read the book, I was encouraged that I think this will be a great conversation.
Kieran, how did you come to the book? What were your initial thoughts as you sort of prepared to read it?
Similar to Danielle, this book was Danielle's suggestion, as you mentioned. But I'm all about relationships and community, and just trying to understand how we can think about improving our relationships with one another. Just at a personal and interpersonal level, but also as communities, and looking at the larger scale around our nation and even bigger, global communities.
I mean, digging into the book itself, I mean, I guess broad overview, I always like to start kind of like, how did you, where did you land on this book? Did it meet your expectations? How did you feel about the way that he defined loneliness? How did you feel about where he ended up? Just general thoughts at the beginning.
I really appreciated the book. I think so. Dr. Vivek splits the book into two halves. In the first half, he is kind of diagnosing, I think, this problem of loneliness and what's going on and why is it happening and why is it particularly prevalent now. And this is he wrote this before COVID. It was released during a COVID year, but written before that. And then the second half of the book is about community and how do we respond to loneliness? If it is such a problem, then what can we do about it? Well, actually, the solution is both one of the most simple, but also one of the most complex things, and it's relationship, and how do we do that well? I really appreciate that. I think that overall arc is really powerful and good. I think we can come back to this a bit later. I had some critiques, I guess, of his conversation around community. I think there is more to be said around that. I think it is deeper and messier and more confusing than he was able to cover perhaps in his book. But his definition and unpacking of loneliness and the health complications that come as a result of that, the connections that it has to when we are lonely to all of life, and also his comments that loneliness is something that actually all of us experience, that it's not particular to one group of people, whether you're rich or poor or black or white or have a degree or don't. It doesn't matter what your life looks like, you are likely to experience loneliness at some point. So then it's a question of, well, how do we respond to that well? And I thought that was really Great.
Yeah, I think as Surgeon General, he did a really good prognosis of the issue. And I think, again, it's one of these ideas that seems really obvious and something that we could all get on board with. But he's done a really great job of collecting a lot of stories. And this was part of his introduction, which is looking at doing a sort of whistle-stop tour around the States when he first became Surgeon General. And one thing that just struck him again and again was just that there was essentially a loneliness epidemic, and the challenge as a doctor of saying I'm here for broadly for physical well-being and physical healing, but everyone who's presenting to me has significant challenges with loneliness. And so I think he's done an excellent job as far as sort of collating the stories and weaving together a bunch of narratives from his experience and from others.
Kind of evidence of the problem.
Yeah, and just being able to flesh that out. But I think, like at the end, he sort of talks about, well, we need to design schools, we need to make sure that our workplaces and our communities are built for connection, for human connection, but there's again very little as to the nature of that, and perhaps that's just the natural way of these things, that there's not one big solution for it all. It's something that needs to come from the ground up.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was really struck by the effectiveness of stories, because you almost, because of the way that, like he has this kind of diagnosis at the beginning of like, here's all the ways in which, all these things have contributed, and I'm identifying all these sort of unique things like, technology and the way that it's enabled us to move around and leave our families of origin, and, the way that sort of acceptance of different lifestyles of living and individualism have meant that people have left, I guess, sort of the more homogenous communities that once, like he talked about the Hutterites, and, but in order to belong to that Hutterite community, you have to, basically sign up to all their beliefs. And if you don't want to live like that, then you sort of are cast out and you can't be part of them anymore. And so there's all this really great diagnosis, and you kind of want that same kind of like scientific precision and like, okay, how do we, what's the answer here? But I almost found that part of I grew a little bit frustrated with a bit of the sort of scientific diagnosis side of loneliness as well. Like, to me, there was this sense of going, well, it's not really just loneliness. Like when he talked about, there's a quote rather early on where it says that when people feel that they belong to one another, their lives are stronger, richer, and more joyful. And then he also talked a lot about, it was like he wanted to bring things into loneliness, which I didn't really feel had to do with loneliness. Like he talked a lot about people kind of serving and joining groups and just finding a purpose, and I was like, the thing is that what he refers to as loneliness, I almost feel like is a twin sort of an amalgamation of a lack of belonging and a lack of purpose, rather than disconnection from people necessarily. That what he's identifying as a despair. Loneliness kind of feels like a despair that he's trying to sort of grasp at, which is a twin thing. It's about purpose and it's about belonging, and both of those two things are real heart cries of every human being. We all want belonging, and we all want to know what our purpose is, and both of those things really heavily point to what our identity is, which is, again, I would say a massive sort of heart cry, or kind of a sort of a cultural thing where we're all kind of meant to find out who we really are. It's like, I think I've talked at length before about, Disney movies and, authentic identities and, who am I and all that sort of stuff. And people are well aware of my frustration with that sort of angst. But I mean, really, truly, this lack of purpose and lack of belonging was what I sort of saw. And he even mentions them by name a couple of times, but I kind of wanted him to kind of, I guess, if the book is called Together and it's explicitly about loneliness, I feel like the next step is to actually acknowledge, why we need a purpose as human beings, because he did a whole bunch of stuff around the sort of, went into a lot of detail around the evolutionary reason why we needed to be together with people and how we'd all kind of evolved to need, socialization and stuff. But what's this evolutionary answer for why we need purpose, or why we crave purpose in our lives?
I mean, I hear you on belonging and purpose and the connection there, but I think also where he sort of lands and what the outcome of the story the stories that he articulates is that our purpose is in the belonging and the purpose is in the relationships. That's something that we as humans all have as our purpose, at least from my experience, as distinct from a sort of a career purpose or that kind of sense of thing. I was a little bit frustrated with the scientific nature of it as well, and the nature of the evidence being used. But partially, I think this is just the reality of these kinds of books and trying to tell these kinds of stories,
like
to
having your
today's
ideas
culture.
accepted.
Yep, which requires A, some sort of neuroscientific evidence, B, potentially some sort of evolutionary rationale as to why we are how we are. C, stories, but I'm down with stories. That's okay. But there's just and also the other part was that the big rationale as to why loneliness, why we should even care about it, is because it's all of a sudden a health issue, and we generally care about health issues because they're about our physical well-being. And so part of the rationale as to why people are starting to care about loneliness is because it's impacting our health through this causal mechanism of chronic stress or the sort of stress-related issues there. So I think part of it's just that reality, which is what people find persuasive today.
And I think part of that is also his journey, right? He was Surgeon General. He is a doctor. He comes from a medical background. It makes sense that he came into this narrative from a health perspective and so was going to write from that perspective. He sees those connections in a way that perhaps you and I wouldn't, because that is not our background.
Like if he was a rabbi, he'd write this differently, or if he was a tech engineer
Exactly.
who was looking at things in terms of human connection or interconnectedness sort of thing, he would structure it differently.
Exactly. And what I found really fascinating is that he was some people call the Surgeon General America's doctor, and he was working for the government in that way, and yet all of his, or most of his stories and his solutions are not emphasizing the role of government. He's recognizing that this is something that you and I, that all of us play a part in responding to well. That it is, it was fascinating to me reading this book and seeing these stories that are so kind of, they come from the bottom up. They're community stories. They are just people experiencing loneliness themselves and thinking, oh, what can I do about that? What will make some impact, not just for me, but for sometimes huge amounts of other people. My mind goes to the story of the female doctor who was also a mother and trying to figure out how to care for her child while also balancing a career, and just set up a Facebook group with some friends, and over time that group has spread to huge numbers, and he knows about it because his wife is now a part of that group, and it's these women asking sometimes really basic things like who's a good babysitter, but also much deeper questions of I don't know, how do I manage or be? Is it okay for me to be a mum and a working doctor? They're working through these really complex issues of life because someone felt lonely and recognized that others might be able to help her, and in doing so, recognized that others were also feeling lonely. And this is a community and personal response rather than government policy, which is interesting to see in comparison to the UK, where a couple of years ago a Minister for Loneliness was a new role that was established, and they've got government strategies for combating this because they've recognised that, and it's a very different approach. It will be fascinating to see over time how those different approaches work.
That is something I also reflected on, just how all of these stories came out of a moment of someone's unique experience, or someone going, oh, this is what I had in my family growing up, or this is what I wish I had, and now I see a need for it. And I particularly think of the woman who she was in that new neighborhood and she wanted to make friends, and she wanted to and she realized that actually she was a gatherer. Like she was a person who, and it's funny because that exact same thing happened to me. Like I, was in Auckland, I was alone. I realized, and I was like, oh man, I'm so frustrated. I feel like, all of my friends that I have had, they've moved on into different seasons of their life with family and stuff. And here I am still kind of single, and I don't really know that many people in Auckland. And I was like really challenged. Look, Jeremy, you're actually someone who is a gatherer of people. Like that's actually a strength that you have. And so instead of just, thinking, oh, woe is me, like, you're actually talented at doing this, so you need to be the one who does it. And then when I took the initiative to do it, the number of people that just immediately responded, like I ended up, what I did is I just did an Easter open home one time where I realized that, because I was new to Auckland or relatively new, most of my friends were usually invited away to someone else's batch by their other friend groups over Easter weekend. And so I was often, like for the first 3 years of living in Auckland, I was alone in Auckland over Easter. And it really sucked. And it was like some of the lowest moments of my life. And then one Easter, I was just like, right, okay, cool. I'm going to see who else is out there who has the same thing going on. And I just put on Facebook an event called the Easter Orphans Open home. And it was like a whole Saturday, Easter Saturday, the house was just going to be open for anyone who wanted to come. And like something like 40 people came, and from that one event, now I still have, like that was the first time that my now wife and I like actually hung out together. But from that one event, like I have a whole group of friends that I still hang out with like 5 years later. And it's just amazing, even the girl who went to university and sort of found herself overwhelmed by the loneliness at university, she started putting it out there, oh, look, I'm lonely. And the number of people that she thought had it all together. And often the thing that I noted about the stories was that it always, connection always involved an element of vulnerability and also sacrifice. And I don't know if he used the word sacrifice in this book, but it's just like...
There's talk of service, but it's not quite...
Yeah, it's not the same.
Yeah.
Service is like this high-minded thing of like, oh, yes, an act of service.
It's a value.
Yeah, and I'm like, but genuinely, like the messy kind of, he talks also about how, the communities that he came from in India, where everyone knew your business and it was just, there was no privacy and stuff like that. Sometimes there is always a sacrifice in having this kind of like joyous, messy community life where everyone's in each other's business, because by definition, you have to give up individualism and some elements of privacy.
Exactly. That was my frustration with the second half of the book, is that I felt like he painted this lovely and pretty and friendly picture of community without discussing how difficult that can be. And actually community sometimes it requires being friends with the person that you don't actually think that you naturally get along with, or that is not easy to be friends with, the person whose life is messy. All of our lives are going to have moments that are messy and hard and difficult, and those are the moments that we most need community around us. So we need to be prepared to walk through those valleys with our communities, to be vulnerable, to give up some of our pride sometimes when we're in those valleys, and be prepared for people to support us, but also to walk alongside others. And I think it felt like a real weakness of the book to not grapple with that tension, that yes, community can be fun and beautiful and wonderful, but part of that beauty is in the hardness of it.
Because he's advocating for more and better quality human connection, but connections, you're connected to others, and others are messy and you are messy, and that's not always as rosy as what he's painted it out here to be. But I think, as you're saying, Jeremy, I think that sense that each time there was vulnerability in each of these stories, and one of the real strengths of the book is sort of, and one of his stated goals is trying to destigmatize loneliness, that it is, and he calls it like just a signal, like hunger or thirst, that we're lacking something, that in this case it's human connection. And to the extent that these communities, the stories of the community builders or gatherers, as you've called it, it always revolves on someone saying, actually, I'm feeling lonely, and inviting others into that And it's just astonishing. Not astonishing, it's just amazing how many others are like, oh, me too. And that's how this kind of starts, that it is a very normal human thing to feel loneliness. It's a lack of this deep human need to be connected. And so I think to the extent that the book sort of makes that message clearer, then that's a really good thing.
He does also talk about, I guess in his diagnosis, talks about the particular groups that are perhaps more vulnerable, and we're very quick to say that the elderly are that the elderly are vulnerable to loneliness, and that is true. But he also talks about young people and the impact of social media and technology, for example, on that. And I think that's something that is easy to forget or not recognize until you've connected with this kind of research or read a book like this.
Yeah, I've actually looked at some of the New Zealand stats for this, and the 15 to 24 age group is by far the loneliest, as far as, people expressing they've been lonely some of the time in the last X amount of weeks. And the 25 to 34 range is the second most lonely. And the elderly, 65 to 74 and 75 plus, are the least likely to say that they've been lonely most or some of the time. And it's just, it's not, it seems counterintuitive at the start. But then you do think about some, and he talks about it in the book around the role of technology. And one of the points which I resonated with was Dr. Murthy speaking about the importance of quality relationships. Yes. People who, and I think he just articulates it as people whom around you can be yourself, and who know you, and you don't need to put on that mask. You don't need to pretend you're someone else. And that we don't need that many of them to get by. We just need some. But all of the sort of cultural currents are pushing against that. With social media, there is some sort of need for some movement against that.
It's so interesting that the use of technology, the way he describes it led me to kind of write down, this sort of sense of, if you use technology as a window rather than a platform. So technology can't be a place that you go to. You can use video calling to call someone and see them and talk to them, and have that kind of live interaction. You can use Facebook to reconnect, as almost like an index. He mentioned, finding some old friends, and then that was a way that he basically was able to index them, find them, first communicate with them, but then it transformed into an in-person. And I always found that the stories, like you mentioned the story before about the physicians, physician mums Facebook group, where the story really got to the point where I almost cried was when it talked about, when someone mentioned that they had a huge loss or something like that they actually banded together and went over to the person's house and made them meals and did things that were physically real and entered someone's physical world to do something practical for them. And it's because those interactions are the ones that actually cost us something, right? Those are the things that make a sacrifice. And I think about even, talking about at the very, very end when he talks about his parents and the fact that, they woke their children up in the middle of the night because they found out that one of his parents' patients had just died and they needed to go and grieve with that patient's wife. And they man, I have a young child. I'm about to have 2 young children. The thought of waking my young children from sleep in the middle of the night to go, because it's so important that someone doesn't do this alone, and it would be my responsibility to make sure that person wasn't alone, even if I was just their doctor. That's a level of love, not just sacrifice. It's just love and care for a human being that how many of us, and so often it's just oh, well, I'm not the person to do that. And it's actually, if you decide you're the person who's going to do that, often that means you are going to be the person who does that.
It's right. If too many people say, I'm not going to be that person, then perhaps there's going to be no one.
And I shouldn't be expected to be that person, and it's just actually the stories that he talks about are basically, that really have an impact are where people go, look, I might not be the person they expect to do that, but if no one else is going to do it, well, someone has to do it. And that idea of, well, this is the right thing to do, regardless of my connection to this person, that sense of a community rightness, or that, and I can't remember where I was having this conversation recently, but the idea of I was actually having this conversation with Sir Kim Workman, and he was talking about kind of Māori and Jewish notions of wrongdoing and forgiveness, that in those cultures, it's not just the individual perpetrator and the individual victim that feels the pain of what's happened. That when something wrong has been done, the victim's whole family, it's an insult to the honor of that family. And it's also about the perpetrator's whole family and the community that they come from. There is a dishonor that they are like, well, as a whānau unit, as a family unit, we have a responsibility to this other whānau, that we need to make this right, even if the perpetrator themselves isn't willing to be a part of it. And so it's like there's a sense of a sort of a community, and he talked about, I can't remember the Māori word that he used, but the sense of, disturbance in what should be, and when something, and so that the whānau has a responsibility to correct the sort of balance between them, and they can't kind of rest until it's done. But that communal sense, a collective sense of holding what is right, and making sure that the right thing is done. I mean, it can be oppressive, and immediately, as soon as we start talking about these collective communities and responsibilities, our kind of Western individualism, well, what if I don't agree with it or something like that? And there's parts of this where I don't feel like he's done quite enough to reckon with that. Well, how do you balance an individual perspective and, people's individual rights with the need to belong? But there was just, there's something about that sort of sense of what is right among us all that is just, it's almost like the silent melody that's running through the entire book.
The inherent relatedness of us all.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess, arising out of that idea of individualism, that I really liked how he zeroed in on that, I think what he calls the damaging myth of like the man apart or the self-made hero. That's a sort of legend or mythos in Western culture of like, oh yeah. And actually, I'd never heard it really connected to that sort of primacy of the nuclear family before. But man, like just, that sense of the fact that us disappearing into kind of nuclear family units that weren't kind of, where we sort of almost divided ourselves away from our extended family in ways that, other countries and other cultures just would never recognize as valid. And what that's actually done to our ability to live together and to have the sort of flexibility and the ability to absorb kind of big life shocks.
Yeah, and I think that it goes beyond that. It's also where you get into the technology and the movement of our societies. Now we move from one thing to another pretty quickly, and both physically and I guess professionally, we're not stable, and so community takes roots. It requires time. It requires investment in a particular place. It requires place, and technology adds to that when we're constantly looking at things that other people are doing, things that are exciting, or we're seeing people on their best days and they're traveling, or perhaps not at the moment, but starting new jobs or new opportunities, or their families are doing exciting things, and we want to be in that position, and so we're encouraged to kind of follow that lead, but that doesn't encourage us to invest in the small things, which actually are so meaningful, and so essential to everyday life.
Because one of the interesting things that he touches on is, I can't recall the precise terms, but basically valuing oneself, the relationship with oneself, so connection.
Like when you talk about solitude.
Solitude is part of what comes out of that. Solitude is a way to develop that. The more we view our friends' Facebook feeds with all the awesome stuff they're doing, the more worthless we can feel. And so, and that's part of this vicious cycle of loneliness, which is why it's linked to depression and other sort of mental health issues as well, is that we tend to curve in on ourselves and start to see ourselves as not worth knowing or not worth, of course I'm lonely, of course no one wants to hang out with me.
He talks about the shame that comes with loneliness,
shame.
Which I thought was fascinating. I was like, it connected. I understood what he meant by that, but I hadn't made that connection previously.
Yeah, and which brings it back to the vulnerability point as well, that it does take some sense of bravery to call out and say, hey, this is how I'm feeling. Do you feel like this too? And it sounds like all of these examples, there's a chorus of people who are feeling the same, which again nails that point of this is a normal thing. It's a normal human thing to feel lonely, and it's a sign, it's a symbol, it's an indicator of something else needs to happen. Just as he talks about as hunger. If we're feeling hungry, we need to eat, and this is the same thing. There's a deep need for connection.
He also talks about, I think, going back to a bit to what you were saying earlier, Kieran, around quality versus quantity. He talks about introverts versus extroverts, and says that extroverts can be lonely as well. And in fact, you can. And actually, you could be in a crowded room and feel incredibly lonely. You could also be in a room with just one other person or one or two other people and not, or be alone and not feel lonely because you're in solitude and valuing that space and that moment alone. You just also need those connections, good quality connections with others. So I think it's really important that we don't just pass off loneliness as a problem for the introverts, because it is for all of us.
Yeah, I found that, something really clicked when he finally admitted that the definition of loneliness is so dependent on expectations as well, that actually social expectations of what a certain environment should be, or what expectations you bring to specific moments as well. I mean, there's a reason why Easter weekend for me was such a sort of a pivotal moment, where each year I was like, 4 days of holiday and I've got no one to hang out with, because I had, my expectation of growing up is that Easter weekend is where you've got all this time, you can hang out with your family and friends, and everyone's got that time off so you can be on holiday together, and therefore my expectations are raised of whereas if my expectations were like, oh, thank goodness, all my flatmates are gone, I've got all this time to kind of get stuff done around the house, and I've got 4 days, I can fill it with all these fun things that I've been meaning to get to for ages, if that was my expectation. And I even found that, interesting how he compared the expectations of kind of Northern Europeans and the kind of Scandinavian countries of the elderly, the expectations of how much the elderly expected to be, in daily relationship with people, versus the expectations of Southern Europeans, like in Italian sort of families, where the expectation is that the young will always kind of venerate the old and kind of, be there for them. That was it was interesting how practical that immediately just clicked into place. Of course. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and part of this whole discussion is that I felt like even the term loneliness seems like this very porous idea that means a lot of different things, or is kind of loneliness as a place that has a lot of different entry points and severities depending on the person. So, even talking about loneliness as kind of a mental health problem versus loneliness as a social problem, or loneliness as an existential problem. Like, there's all these different versions of it, and I agreed with all of the ones that he sort of brought up, but I also don't feel like necessarily it's like, it's the whole, put your hand on the elephant in the dark, and describe which part of it you've got.
And it is just inherently one of these difficult kind of messy human concepts that different disciplines are going to come at it from different angles. And so he's done a pretty good job at pulling some of those together. But I think there is that general sense that it is necessarily a kind of subjective thing. And we're all designed in different ways, or wired. We're all wired in different ways and feel loneliness in different situations or into different severities. And he sort of makes a distinction between that and social isolation, which is a bit more easily measurable, and because that's just your level of connection with others, like physical connection with others, whereas loneliness is more of a subjective, am I feeling a lack of belonging?
Exactly. He talks about the young girl at school who's lonely, and her mother describes to him that what she felt was not, or that loneliness is an absence of something rather than bullying, which is it's an action, it's doing something. That's right. And loneliness is it's essentially neglect. It's a product of neglect. It's forgetting that there might be someone at the lunch table who's sitting by themselves again, and forgetting that actually, or being so involved in your own space, right, and not recognizing that person might need some community or to be welcomed into a group as well.
But I guess by the same token, being bullied would make you feel lonely.
Yes.
And having no one step up to defend you.
But that's where I think this is loneliness is this thing that is connected to all these different issues, because he also talks about loneliness and its connection to drug addiction problems, for example. Some people who are lonely fill that with these different responses. And another one is another way in which people respond is through political polarization, and to stick to people who are alike to them, who think alike, where we've talked a lot in our office about the need to talk to people who are different from us, who think differently from us, how difficult that is, but how important that is, even just as a society politically, to be able to disagree well and to hear different points of view, and not to do that over the internet, over Facebook, where you can just write whatever you want and it's just a screen, but to sit across from someone and recognize their humanity, and listen to their perspective. He quotes Brene Brown in the book, and she says that people are hard to hate close up, and I think that is so true, and this is, it's just another facet of where he's seeing I think the spider legs kind of, or the tendrils of loneliness eking into these different areas of life.
Yeah, I mean, that leads into the discussion around, I guess, the three bowls that he talks about. Basically, for those who haven't read the book and are listening to this podcast, he talks about the three bowls, where the first bowl is a very narrow, deep bowl, and so that's kind of like the Hutterite community, where you are, a narrow bowl would mean that you are, contained in a very small amount of space, and so you're up close, but so it can be a little bit uncomfortable because you haven't got a lot of ability to be far away from one another on any number of kind of ideological, or there's not a lot of space away from each other, but you're very, very deep, and so that sort of community where you do everything together, you share everything, and you're kind of held, and everything is provided for you as long as you're a part of it. And then there's the second bowl is that very flat, wide bowl where you can kind of range around inside the bowl anywhere you want to. You don't actually have to interact with anyone. You're not shoved up against anyone. It's not very comfortable. It's not uncomfortable. But it's also very shallow. There's not, you don't really get to go down very far, very deep. And then he just says, the third bowl, and he's just like talking. It's like, this bowl is this amazing bowl which contains the best of both worlds. And I wrote it down as a quote. I copied it out because I was like, this is entertaining to me. In this third bowl, the sense of common ground would be just as solid as in a traditional culture, but individuals would bond on the basis of personal choice, interests, and ideals, rather than primarily the circumstances of their birth. This cultural container would preserve individual freedom of expression so that people can be who they are and interact with others as they wish and need to, with solitude as desired, but it would also offer structures to prevent loneliness by engendering connection and trust and providing opportunities for gathering. And I was like, and then actually later on, he also said, we've emphasized freedom of individual expression without also ensuring that the underpinnings of community are protected and strengthened. Now we need to recapture our investment in the collective elements that matter, our relationships, our community organizations, our neighborhoods, our social and cultural institutions, and we must do this while continuing to protect individual expression. And I just wrote after it in all caps, cake and eat it too. Like,
yeah, how do you do that?
It's just
the
like
utopian third bowl.
Yeah, allow me to be as individual as I want to be, and to not have to like. I mean, I get what he's saying, that there's this, and then this is obviously kind of, I guess, the liberal pluralistic society that we've all been trying to kind of like figure out where we sit within for a very long time, where hey, you can have your beliefs and I'll have mine, and mine don't have to shut you down or whatever. But ultimately, and he talks about this idea of common ground. And what's interesting is that the closest I think he ever comes to getting a real vision of common ground is in the story of the white supremacist Derek Black, and the Jewish man Matthew, who invites him to Shabbat and ends up being friends with him for 2 years. And when Matthew was asked why he was, what made him want to reach out and invite this guy to Shabbat once his sort of, because he'd basically been at this college for a year, and then while he was overseas on a trip, someone at the college found out that his father was the founder of Stormfront, which is a white supremacist kind of news website, and that he had, and that Derek himself had hosted sort of, white supremacist talk shows and all that sort of stuff, and he was kind of outed as this hateful person, and a whole bunch of the campus just sort of shut their doors to him. But this guy, Matthew, invited him to Shabbat and never once mentioned, for 2 years as friends, never once mentioned, like, hey, by the way, I know that you're a white supremacist and you think that, Jews like me are, the scum of the earth. And he was asked, like, why did you do that? And how could you just be friends with this guy without, airing the differences between you or talking about the elephant in the room? And he said, I have a fundamental belief that every person has a spark of the creator inside of them. We have a common humanity, but a common repository of something sacred. And it's like, that was the only, I guess, compelling reason why we would need to have common ground with people that we don't like or we disagree with. Like, what is it about, just because we have a common humanity, like, that doesn't seem to be enough. Like, someone might be human, but they're an annoying human. It seems that there needs to be some sense of sacredness that is indelible within someone, even if they've done the most horrendous thing. There needs to be a sense of sacredness. And I guess, where does that sacredness come from? Like, how does that understanding, how do we develop that, I guess, that understanding and hold that in common, regardless of what our sort of religious or philosophical beliefs are?
Yeah, I think you're right, Jeremy, that there needs to be something that's common, because just a sense of, because it sounds like he is showing some of the probably more just progressive sense of being, as far as saying that the individual expression is what holds us together. But that's kind of a bit of a paradox, in the sense that that's not yes, we might share the opportunity to express ourselves, but that's not necessarily something that binds us together. And this is kind of the modern liberal challenge, is to find that something that beyond personal freedom, which is broadly the second bowl, a society that looks like the second bowl, people call it atomized, which is kind of the excessive individualism that we live by today, which is what he's trying to correct in this book. What is it that does hold us together? And I mean, that's one option. I think earlier Danielle mentioned the importance of place, and I think that's something that isn't necessarily articulated here, because it is sort of looking at this broad idea of just human connection is a good thing in general. He touches on it a little bit with both the ideas, or looking at technology and looking at COVID as well, and the issue of the pandemic, and that sense that he is clear that there is no substitute for the in-person interactions, the face-to-face, that technology is only valuable in this instinct, where in this sense where it is strengthening the quality of relationships rather than diluting them. But that does need to happen in a place. I think place and belonging to a particular area is something that can be a way of binding us. I mean, I've always found the idea of loving one's neighbor really profound, that it's a neighbor and not just your family or not just someone else, because a neighbor is essentially someone who just happens to be nearby.
You
in
don't
all of
choose them.
You don't choose them. And this is the thing that's profoundly not liberal, is the not choosing. It's the people who you just happen to be around in this particular place, this particular time. And loving them does involve the sacrifice and the costliness. But that's where paradoxically, a lot of our purpose can come from as well.
Yeah, I was going for a walk a few days ago with a friend after work, and we were walking through a dog park, and her comment to me was, wow, this is so fascinating. It's bringing together all these people who have dogs, but you wouldn't normally see them interacting with one another. And I was lamenting actually the loss of the town square that we used to have, which was that space where people would be forced to interact with people that they just lived nearby. And as you went to the shops, you would bump into different people. And as you went to work or just lived your daily life, there was this common place where everyone just connected. And we don't really, particularly in cities like Auckland, we don't really have that space anymore, or those spaces are few and far between. And I think I've heard it said that, well, the internet is now the common, the public square, but it's really not, because we're connecting with people that we choose and that we want to listen to, and actually the algorithms are assisting us in that.
And they're shallow, necessarily shallow, but as Jeremy was saying, can be like gateways or ways into deeper relationships, but don't necessarily have to be. And I remember in the pandemic, someone described, because we were sort of, I was at least lamenting staring at a screen even more hours in my day through Zoom meetings, and someone described sort of Zoom and those kind of connections as like tinned fruit, not quite the real thing. And that sort of metaphor really resonated with me. It's like, yeah, it's okay, and it tastes, all right, but actually it's not the real thing. It's a substitute, and it can never sort of fully satisfy. Again, just that inherent face-to-faceness. And he talks a bit about sort of just the realities of body language and just the sort of the way that we connect face to face is just different.
Well, and just even I noticed that, for us last year when we weren't in the office, the only times that I'd see you were when we would book in a Zoom meeting to talk about work. And like, I wouldn't, see either of you walking down the hallway to go get a coffee. I wouldn't, there wouldn't be like, oh, are you heading down to get lunch? Like, let's go get that as well. And often those sort of like, it's weird because it's like this sort of sense of a convenience factor that sort of pushes you together. And there's even the story of...
it's neighborliness, isn't it?
It's
being in the same place.
There's like a sense of co-location is both convenient and frustrating, at different times. And friendship is born out of the continued kind of perseverance of frustration and enjoyment of convenience, right? And so, the story of the woman that he talks about who, she would go to these conferences every month in a different city, and the only people that she knew were her workmates. And then they were at the end of one of the trips, she was booking a room and there was only one room left, and the workmate that she sort of semi-knew was like, oh, why don't we just share that room? And she was like, oh my gosh, like, this is so weird. Why would I share a room? And then they shared a room and they ended up having these deep conversations because there was no one else to talk to. And then it became this sort of lifelong friendship, and it's like these sort of accidents of sort of who you end up just being sort of put with that you would never have chosen necessarily. I think that kind of accidental sense of, oh, I found you, and being seen by someone who had no reason to see you, those are like some of the greatest joys of life, right? Of like actually being chosen and loved by someone who has no reason to do so. And I even found that, in the section where he was talking about the Alexis de Tocqueville kind of pre-political associations, so voluntary associations where the relationship comes first, and any kind of sense of I need to change your mind about this thing that you believe or this thing that makes you someone else or other to me. And this was coming out of the sort of Derek Black white supremacist conversation, where the example of Matthew was that even though he was Jewish and knew that this guy was a white supremacist, he chose not to talk about that for the first 2 years of their friendship.
That's right. He's focused on the person and the relationship.
And how hard would that be?
Exactly.
It's sort of told as a story of like, oh, this is so great. Like, what a great person. Genuinely, you are a Jewish person living as a minority, inviting this white supremacist who's literally, said publicly that, you and your family are disgusting and made jokes about, all kinds of stuff. And you've chosen not, you had the wisdom to go, I believe that there's something more here that I can get, rather than just one-upping this guy.
And you're not just inviting him to have dinner, inviting him into one of your religious practices.
Yeah.
So seeing the fullness of what you believe and live, and you're part of the world. I think it's amazing.
And it's like, that in itself is like an act of faith. It's a faith in the fact that there might be something more valuable to come out of a relationship that you might not yet have. And coming out of that discussion of pre-political association, there was just this sort of offhand comment that I thought was really powerful about the fact that community gatherings should never be described as family or friends. that there needs to be, that we actually need these kind of bridge spaces. And he even said, he sort of critiqued that there are a lot of churches that say, our church is a family. And he's like, well, no, you're not. Like, but you shouldn't try to be. And actually it's more valuable if you operate as this kind of open space that can create bridges between people who don't yet know each other. And we lack those sort of open bridging spaces. And I guess, you've got those, that girl who was at college who sort of went and did the yoga course and said, I just want to open up this sort of Airbnb space. That's a bridge space where anyone who wants to can just come in and find themselves co-located and find themselves just sharing life and stories. And that's where that kind of genuine human connection can happen.
I just have a few questions. I'm curious around your guys' thoughts. This book was released in April last year, but obviously Dr. Vivek had written it, had done all of his research and talking to people prior to the pandemic, and I just wonder how different it would have been if it had been released now, a year later, and what he might have changed, what he might have included, particularly around that conversation around technology. We have had to rethink how we engage with community, how we engage with different people, how relationships happen, particularly in places like Europe and America, where they've been in lockdown for a lot longer than we have. But I think there's some things that we have to learn through this time of, well, first, how do we build relationship through that time? And I think we've covered that a little bit. But then also, well, how, as we transition out of lockdown and out of a pandemic into more normal life, what are some of the things that we want to take with us? How do we get used to kind of community again? What are some things that we need to be repeating or being intentional about in our lives to ensure that community is fostered and relationship is fostered? What can we learn from this time period?
One thing that he articulates that I was reading about in a later interview, sort of a post-COVID interview, was one of his sort of big hopes from the book and from this time was that we would start to live up to a lot of our values that we express in words, that our family, the people closest to me are the most important, whereby in sort of normal everyday we could get caught up in our jobs, in other activities, whatever we're into, and sort of just take our those closest to us for granted. And I think here he sort of what the pandemic did was partially make us realize that we sort of don't know what we've got till it's gone, as far as a lot of our connections. And so I don't know, I'm a simple man, and sometimes it requires a crisis to make me realize deep truths. But it can often take something of that magnitude to realize that actually you need to change your ways and do things a bit differently, and be a bit more deliberate with those around you and your connections. And realize that, I actually really miss catching up with people face to face, and that again, this yes, we can use technology more deliberately, I think, to develop as a way into deeper relationships, but that actually just taking all the opportunities we can to build those communities and to build relationships with those around us. I guess, in a few words, it's sort of a renewed vigor for deeper relationships with those around us.
One of my takeaways from, I guess, a lockdown mindset was the sense of, and it was kind of relates to that vulnerability thing of like, over lockdown, you knew that everyone was stuck in their house and had nothing to do at night. and was kind of like looking for human connection. And so what was really interesting, and I saw this happening in a number of different friend groups that I could sort of be connected to, was that people were organizing like online quizzes on Friday nights, like, hey, let's do a big online quiz. And like, a whole bunch of my friends would get together every Friday night on Zoom, and like someone would have done a quiz, and one of them is definitely listening to this podcast, so hi Todd. But what was really fascinating about it is that as soon as lockdown finished, that practice of us all kind of like, hey, we're all at home, why don't we hang out tonight, was just gone. It was completely over. And I was just like, well, all of us have children. Pretty much all of us are guaranteed to be alone at home most nights. Like
Different kind of lockdown.
Yeah, still in lockdown.
yeah. Like, and it made me go, oh, there was something about lockdown where we all realized that everyone was kind of going through the same thing. And it wasn't, it was fine for people like, well, you're at home alone, so why don't you join this cool quiz that I'm doing? Whereas now it's like, oh, well, I don't know if they're busy, so let's not, I won't suggest that. Or, there's sort of more of a tentative thing around suggesting, I guess hanging out or getting together in a big group. So I guess one of the lessons I'd hope, that I would, try to carry with me is not assuming that people are busy or just because someone's busy on a particular time. And also the willingness to just invite and make a larger group of people, and this is one of the real big challenges is that we so often, for me, I'm like, I haven't gotten to see, this person that I'm about to invite over for dinner in such a long time. I really want to be able to have like a great conversation with them. And so I'll only invite over like, one couple or, to come and hang out with my wife and I. But really, like, what would it mean to someone who doesn't often get an invite to those sorts of things if I invited like 3 couples? And had a larger group? Sure, it's going to change the nature of that gathering and that conversation that we can have. But I guess, making the table bigger and deciding to include people who are not my best friends, that is, in reality, right at the beginning of this conversation, you're talking about kind of how the book sort of doesn't tend to suggest systemic changes that need to be made, because actually people can't belong to a system. People who are lonely are going to be helped by individuals who decide that it is their responsibility to address the loneliness that they see around them. It's not going to be a Surgeon General who can develop a government plan to, and sorry to the Minister of Loneliness in the UK, but it seems that this book is really, emphasizing that loneliness is a problem that is multifaceted. It comes from many, many different places. And the good and bad news is that the solutions are going to come from many, many different places, but that the solution can only be coming from people who want to offer even just the smallest sense of belonging to the people who maybe they don't even know need that sense of belonging and purpose. And that's a huge challenge to all of us because, as we've sort of covered and as he covers really well, we are used to this culture of self-reliance, of privacy, of individual success, of pursuing personal fulfillment. And a lot of the time actually addressing loneliness and helping others to belong requires us to sort of put some of that down and just open up.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's where I've landed as well, is that community and relationship are something that it requires something of me, and it's not just for me. It's not just when it's easy for me or suits me. Actually, it is going to be hard, and it's not going to suit me all the time. But it's really important that I get involved in friends' lives in the ways that aren't straightforward, and when it is I'm tired and would rather just have a quiet night in. Actually, sometimes it is really important that you still say yes to that invite, or you invite someone over because they might really need it, and the next time you might really need them. And me not doing that, me not being a part of that relationship and doing that well, me not being vulnerable or being prepared to be vulnerable in those situations, comes at there's a cost to our society if we don't do that, because as this book makes really clear, is that the cost of loneliness is high. It impacts not just us, not just those people that are lonely, and it impacts us as a whole community, as a nation, as a society.
Just to finish us off, Danielle, I was really struck by the Kauai study that was done on the island of Kauai in Hawaii. He refers to it, and basically the researchers looked at a cohort of children that had grown up on that island, and all of the cohort that was studied had similar levels of disadvantage when they were growing up, and similar kind of risk factors for having, poverty or having, just terrible life outcomes. And they looked at them over time, and they specifically looked at the third of those sort of disadvantaged children that somehow managed to sort of rise above that and go on to have like really successful families, successful relationships, and successful careers. And the thing that was common among all of them was that the ones that had sort of, transcended their situation, was that they had close bonding as babies with a significant caregiver. They had close bonds with stable, wider family members who were nurturing and available to them. They had stable community relationships. If their family weren't great, they managed to find and latch on to a, sort of a community member that really took an interest in them. And they specifically mentioned big brothers, big sisters as this opportunity to actually just have a stable relationship in someone's life. And I know that you have been a mentor to a young person for a number of years, and just I wonder, in the spirit of going where it seems like Vivek wasn't necessarily able to go in terms of describing some of the costs, just basically, what has that experience been like for you, being a mentor to a young woman, and what have you seen come out of that?
Yeah, being a mentor is both one of the most wonderful and fulfilling, and also some of the most difficult things to do or to be. I've spent, I think, 4 years now mentoring a young woman, and she is phenomenal. We spend weekends hanging out, baking and going for walks, or doing crafty things and just talking about life. And it's given her space to talk about some really big issues or questions that she's been asking, and also just to see my life. But really my role is just to be her friend and a constant person in her life who she can just come to and ask questions. It's such a privilege to be that person. You definitely, sometimes I can tell when there's a big question coming, because often it's in the car, and she'll be kind of teasing it out a little bit, and I'll just drive a little bit slower and wait for the big question to come. But there's also this kind of always a little bit of a fear of, am I going to be able to answer this well? But actually all she needs is for me to listen. There is often no right answer, but she needs a friend to listen and to know that she is loved, whatever she says. And there's a cost to that, because there's, the emotional investment is actually probably one of the biggest costs. It's the practical cost of time and spending chunks of my weekend with this young person on a regular basis. But there's actually the emotional cost, and sometimes there'll be a stretch of time where I don't hear from her or her mum, and I'm like, what's going on? Is there something wrong that I need to be hearing about? And that's really concerning. But actually every time I catch up with her, I'm so impressed. She's in high school now and doing really well. And she's a well-rounded young woman who cares about the world, who knows that she is loved, and who loves other people around her. She's a big sister and is an amazing big sister to her siblings. And I hope that my relationship with her in that time together has helped her in that process, and learning to love and be that listening ear for her siblings and friends.
Well, the foreword of this book ends with Dr. Murthy's 4 suggestions for how we can sort of combat loneliness. And I'm going to read them out, and I, just to finish off, would like to hear from you what resonates with you and what you would maybe add if you were giving a sort of sense of how to properly combat loneliness and create that sense of belonging and purpose in people's lives, and I guess your own life. Number 1 is spend time each day with those you love, at least 15 minutes each day connecting. Number 2 is focus on each other with full attention and listening, no phones. Number 3, embrace solitude and find that solitary comfort. And then 4, help and be helped, giving and receiving strengthen our social bonds.
I mean, it all sounds good to me. I think all of those suggestions are seeking just for, again, making his point around the quality and the depth of the connection, not being distracted with the phone, being attentive, actually devoting time to those around you. They're just small little habits and practices for those around us. But I think it is missing what Jeremy and Danielle, you've sort of been articulating, is that broader sense of connection to those that go beyond those closest to you, that sense of the commons or the community, the sense of service. So I think, I'd probably add something around not just service, but seeking out others and seeking to connect with them. Because I think the story that Danielle was just talking about her mentorship just points out the power of role models here, and which is a formal way of just saying just people who are doing this well that we can look up to. And that's why this book exists, because he looks up to his parents and the way that they lived and the life that they lived and the example they set with the relationships that they had. So I think that there are some vicious cycles with loneliness, as far as just the turning in and the shame and the brokenness that can follow. But there's also some virtuous cycle potential for the more people actually do get out there, get involved, get over ourselves, and try to connect with others.
Yeah, I would completely echo that. I think in particular that get out there. Don't be timid about inviting people over or saying that you're feeling lonely, even telling people around you that I'm missing some deep connections. Can we go out for a coffee? And I think the stories in this book make it really clear that other people will, if they're not feeling the same thing at that time, will have felt it or know of people who are feeling that way. And that is, I think, the start, that invitation to friendship is the start of connection and community, which is the antidote to loneliness.
When you say, be honest and vulnerable with, I need connection. Sometimes that, he does talk about how, people who are in a lonely place tend to kind of almost like grasp, I need something, and that makes people go, ooh. And I guess if I was to add a 0.5, it sort of comes under the help and be helped thing, but I would also say intentionally create extra pieces of your life that aren't allocated to someone or something already, that someone can grab, and it's something that I have for quite a while, really wanted to make a personal, someone talked to me about this a long time ago, and I was like, that's so amazing. I really want to do that. As much as possible, I always want to make sure that there's an extra bed in my house, so that if I hear about someone who has a need of a place to stay for the night or a place to stay for 2 weeks, maybe, oh my gosh, that it's like, I can always say, oh yeah, I have a bed, we have a place you could sleep. Yeah, there is a place, and whether it's a bed or whether it's making sure that you make enough food, or whatever it is, whatever the extra piece of your life is. The thing is that no one has the right to tell you that you should, create extra space for someone else. And this is so often, I think, the reason why we don't these days in a kind of more individualistic culture is that because people don't sit under the teachings of kind of a cultural faith or a cultural religion that sort of defined what is good within a sort of monolithic culture. We don't have that sort of sense of instruction of everyone's expected to do this. So we're not going to be told, hey, create some extra room in your life, or, be willing to give away part of something that you actually quite enjoyed, like a solitary weekend or time with your family. But actually, if everyone was like, hey, if I see a need, I'm willing to give away some of my family's kind of peaceful time in order to invite someone in. Growing up, my parents would always invite people who were from, because my parents are American, they would always invite Americans who were in New Zealand over Christmas time to come and do Christmas with us. And that is so unusual to me to be like, hey, Christmas time, which is this wonderful time with your family, that's this really precious time, let's invite total strangers into that. When I stop and think about it, but actually growing up, it was the most normal thing in the world. And we have friends all around the world now because of those connections that we made, even just for sometimes one night or one day of the year. And I guess that impetus to give away and create extra pieces of your life that can be given away to anyone who needs them, I think is probably the biggest challenge that I've sort of been reminded of reading this book. So thanks for joining me for the conversation.
Thanks, Jeremy.
You're welcome.
So thanks for joining me for this conversation for the book club this time. And thanks to everyone listening for joining us. If you have any comments, if you have any questions, if you have any feedback, feel free to get in touch with us on bookclub@maxim.org.nz. And make sure, if you would like to sign up to receive notifications of the next books that we are reading, you can also email that email address and ask for the emails to be sent directly to you, or just sign up to our monthly forum emails on our website and you will get that as well. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.